You've probably heard that the Romans loved gladiator fights. But you've been lied to. What really happened inside the Colosseum wasn't noble warriors battling for glory. It was public execution disguised as theater. Lions didn't just attack criminals. They were released through trapdoors on hydraulic elevators, timed to dramatic music. Prisoners were dressed as mythological characters, forced to act out their own deaths in scripted scenes, while tens of thousands cheered. There were lions that refused to cooperate, rhinos that chased senators, entire audiences crushed under collapsing stadiums, and even Christians who died singing, leaving the crowd disturbingly silent for the first time in centuries. Rome didn't stop the games because it became more moral. It stopped because the crowd got bored tonight. I'm going to tell you how the world's most advanced civilization turned death into engineering, and how that machine eventually fell apart. Welcome to the most disturbing arena acts in ancient Rome. The mechanics of death. How the Colosseum turned execution into engineering. Chapter 1. You likely imagine the Colosseum as a place of roaring crowds, gleaming armor, and dramatic clashes between gladiators fighting for honor. That's the story most retellings prefer, the romanticized duel, the noble warrior, the quick, cinematic death. But beneath the sand of the arena floor lay the trapdoors, pulleys, and counterweights of a machine designed not for warfare, but for choreography of death. What happened in Rome's arenas was not spontaneous violence. It was planned, scheduled, and engineered. You might not immediately think of Roman executioners as engineers, yet that is precisely what they were. They worked with carpenters, rope makers, metal workers, even set designers. Their goal was not merely to kill a condemned criminal. It was to present the death in a new and unexpected way. A beheading was boring. A hanging was too quick. Rome needed spectacle. The Colosseum itself, completed in 80 CE under Emperor Titus, was not just a building, it was a programmable death machine. Beneath its arena floor was an entire city of mechanisms. Over 30 elevators, powered by teams of slaves pulling ropes in synchronized rhythm, could raise cages, platforms, and even artificial landscapes from beneath. Trapdoors would spring open under an unsuspecting performer or criminal, dropping them straight into animal pits. Movable scenery could instantly transform the arena into a forest, a desert, or a miniature ocean. Sometimes they even flooded the entire arena basin to stage fake naval battles. You might assume these mechanized wonders were used primarily for gladiator games, but far more often, they were used for executions. Public execution in Rome was not merely punishment. It was entertainment, and it needed themes. Let us reenact the death of Hercules, the announcer might declare. A man convicted of theft is dressed in a lion skin and given a wooden club. The crowd laughs at his pretense of heroism. A costumed actor enters with a torch. Except, unlike in theatrical reenactments, the torch is not fake. The condemned is set ablaze, screaming as he becomes Hercules ascending to the heavens, or so the facade claims. The audience cheers at the cleverness. Another condemned man might be cast as Orpheus, the mythic musician. He would play a lyre or pretend to. Then, right on cue, a trapdoor would release a live bear or panther. Orpheus meets his mythic end torn apart by wild beasts. The crowd nods approvingly. Creative, educational, entertaining. But beyond the spectacle, the process itself was surprisingly bureaucratic. Executions were scheduled like stage performances. Each day of the games often followed a rhythm. Morning was for animal hunts. Venations, where trained hunters or criminals were pitted against exotic creatures imported from across the empire. Midday, when the sun was highest and the crowds most irritable, came the executions. The Romans understood something theaters today still know well. The audience gets restless around noon. You might think that was the most grotesque part, but in fact, the audience often treated midday executions as intermissions. Hawkers would walk the stands selling wine, olives, or honeyed nuts while people casually watched men being burned, mauled, or dismembered. One writer even complained that the crowd grew bored when the execution methods lacked variety. Imagine for a moment the level of desensitization it would take for a person to yawn at a man being eaten alive. Yet, that was Rome. Animals were not merely weapons. They were characters in the story. They were given symbolic roles depending on the crime. Adulterers were sometimes thrown to lions, as lions were thought to represent noble fury. Thieves, being sly, were given foxes or jackals. Traitors faced bears, known for their brutality and stubbornness. Occasionally, someone would be tied to a stake while honey was spread over their body, then left to be slowly consumed by insects. You would think wasps or ants don't make for compelling theater. Yet Rome had patience. There was also the famous punishment of damnatio et bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It sounds simple: throw someone into a pit with wild animals. But the Romans made it complicated. They might arm the criminal with a wooden sword. They might blindfold him. They might grease the floor so he would slip repeatedly. They might tie him to a chariot dragged across the arena by panicked horses. In one infamous case, an entire group of condemned men was dressed as sailors and placed in a makeshift ship. Sea lions were released, then crocodiles. The crocodiles did not perform on cue, they wandered aimlessly. The crowd booed. Even the emperors themselves participated, not in fighting, but in curation. Commodus, known for fancying himself a demigod, famously entered the arena not to be challenged, but to show off. He would shoot animals with arrows from an upper platform, sometimes killing an ostrich by severing its head cleanly. He left the body running headless for several more steps to the shock and laughter of the crowd. At one point, he slew 100 lions in a single day, but all from behind protective barriers. It was never a contest. It was pageantry. The question you may be asking now is why? Why did Rome need death to be theatrical? Why wasn't simple punishment enough? There are many theories. Some historians suggest that spectacle reinforced imperial authority. When the state could make death entertaining, it proved absolute control. Some say it was a form of religious expression, a way to honor the gods who demanded sacrifice. Others argue it was about social cohesion, shared horror bringing people together. But perhaps the simplest explanation lies in boredom. Rome was a civilization built on routine. Most citizens lived lives of repetition: farming, trading, sweeping streets, hauling water. A day at the arena was a holiday from monotony. But like any audience, once they had seen one lion attack, they wanted novelty. Violence alone was not enough. It had to be inventive. And inventive it was. One surprisingly common execution involved tying the condemned to a stake and releasing ostriches. You might find this strange: ostriches are not carnivorous. They do not bite people, but they kick. A single kick from an ostrich can disembowel a man. They were also unpredictable. Sometimes they ignored the criminal entirely and charged the crowd instead. Chaos was part of the fun. Then there was the punishment known as the sack of Saturn. A criminal would be sewn inside a leather bag with various animals: a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. The bag was then thrown into the arena or tossed into a river. Inside the dark, airless confines, the animals would panic and attack both each other and the human. The audience could not see inside the sack, but they could hear it. That was enough. Even the sand of the arena had purpose. It was not ordinary sand. It was carefully chosen for its absorbency, often imported from volcanic regions. It soaked up blood quickly. After each execution, slaves with rakes would come out and smooth the surface, covering up the stains. New sand was sprinkled if needed. A fresh stage for the next act. You might assume the executed were always criminals. That would make it easier to rationalize. But not all were guilty by any modern definition. Some were prisoners of war. Some were slaves who angered their masters. Some were debtors. Some were Christians, publicly killed not because they were accused of specific crimes, but because they refused to worship Roman gods. To the crowd, they were performers. There were even volunteers. Some impoverished citizens, unable to pay debts or feed their families, willingly signed contracts agreeing to die in the arena in exchange for payment to their relatives. You might think no one would choose such a fate, yet desperation often outweighs dignity. One writer recounts how a volunteer executioner grew annoyed when spectators criticized his sword techniques. The condemned man, not yet dead, lifted his head and said, "Can't you just kill me properly?" Strange how even in death, people still sought quality service. As you imagine this scene, cheering citizens, elaborate costumes, murderous animals, and underground machinery, perhaps the most unsettling detail is not the violence itself, but how normalized it all was. Parents brought children. Senators nodded along approvingly. Vendors sold souvenirs. There were even professional reviewers who critiqued the performances afterward. Much like modern film critics, the Colosseum was not chaos. It was order. It was death by appointment, which leads to a question. If Rome could turn execution into entertainment, planned, choreographed, expected, was there ever a moment when the system faltered? When a performance did not go as intended? When the machine misfired? What happened when the spectacle lost control? Chapter 2. When the spectacle lost control, arena disasters Rome tried to forget in the previous section. You walked through the clockwork precision of Roman executions, how the Colosseum was less a battlefield and more a stage. Every death had a role. Every condemned man had a script. But no matter how carefully the Romans planned, no machine, no matter how elaborate, functions perfectly forever. There came days when the trapdoors jammed, when the animals did not perform, when the condemned refused to die on schedule. You might assume such failures prompted pity or reconsideration. In fact, they often inspired rage from the audience. One of the earliest recorded arena disasters occurred not in Rome, but in Pompeii. In 59 CE, local gladiators from Pompeii faced rivals from neighboring Nuceria. What began as a competition became a riot. Spectators hurled stones at one another. Wooden benches were torn up and used as weapons. Swords meant for the arena floor were carried into the stands. By the end, blood soaked the seating rather than the sand. The Roman Senate was outraged, not at the violence itself, but that unauthorized violence had taken place. Gladiator shows were to be controlled, not spontaneous. As punishment, Pompeii was banned from hosting games for 10 years. The city itself was scolded like a misbehaving child. But riots were not the only way the spectacle slipped. Animal mishaps were particularly common. In one instance under Emperor Claudius, a rhinoceros broke loose from its handlers and chased senators from their cushioned seats. Cloaks and sandals were found scattered in panic. In another account, a group of leopards refused to attack their assigned victim. The crowd, impatient, began shouting insults, not at the condemned, but at the leopards. Vendors threw meat scraps in an attempt to provoke violence. One frustrated guard ended up stabbing a leopard to encourage participation. It worked, though not in the intended direction. The animal mauled him instead. Sometimes, animals killed the wrong people. Crocodiles introduced for a Nile-themed spectacle once climbed out of the artificial river and wandered into the stands. Spectators trampled each other trying to escape. Lions occasionally attacked costumed stagehands before reaching their intended target. Elephants, when wounded but not killed, were known to trumpet wildly in agony, confusing the audience. Some spectators cried. Others left early in discomfort. Seneca, a Roman philosopher, wrote that watching elephants weep almost made the spectacle inappropriate for entertainment. Almost. This unpredictability was not limited to animals. Humans, too, deviated from their assigned roles. One condemned man scheduled to be eaten by lions knelt and began singing. The lions, perhaps confused, did not approach. The crowd found it amusing at first, then irritating. They demanded he stop singing. When he would not, a soldier struck him with a spear. The crowd roared in approval, not at the kill, but at the restoration of order. There were also executioners who botched their tasks. A man sentenced to be beheaded survived after the sword struck incorrectly. The audience groaned. The executioner apologized and swung again. Still alive. Now the crowd was angry. They began shouting instructions. Some demanded the sword be changed. Others suggested switching to fire. The executioner, flustered, eventually finished the job on the third swing. The execution drew more criticism than sympathy. Roman audiences were not moved by suffering. They were frustrated by inefficiency. And then came the infamous wooden platform collapse of Fidne in 27 CE. This was not even in a formal amphitheater, but a temporary wooden structure built by a private organizer hoping to profit quickly. Tens of thousands attended. The structure, overloaded, gave way. An estimated 20,000 people died in the collapse. More were injured. Rome mourned but briefly. Within weeks, writers observed that the tragedy had already become a subject of jokes in taverns. Rome's appetite for spectacle was not dulled. It was merely interrupted. Disasters like these reveal an uncomfortable truth. The Roman arena did not run on cruelty alone, but on expectation. The crowd came not merely to see death, but to see death delivered reliably. When the system glitched, outrage followed, yet some failures were not just accidental, they were philosophical. Under Emperor Nero, theatrical flamboyance reached absurd levels. Nero, obsessed with performance, insisted on staging executions as elaborate narratives. One condemned woman was forced to play the role of Iphigenia, the Greek princess sacrificed by her father. She walked calmly to her supposed altar, expecting a symbolic gesture. Instead, the priest performing the role plunged a real knife into her chest. Nero applauded. The audience gasped not from horror, but from confusion. Was it art? Was it execution? The line blurred. Even the condemned sometimes refused to play their part. One prisoner, scheduled to die by being devoured, reportedly shoved his head into the wheel of a passing cart before reaching the arena, breaking his neck instantly. The crowd, upon hearing the news, booed not for the death, but for being denied the entertainment. Others attempted to escape during processions. Some succeeded. Some were killed on the streets before reaching their final performance. There were also those who embraced their fate theatrically. A condemned gladiator, knowing he was slated to lose and die, leapt willingly onto his opponent's sword rather than prolong the humiliation. The audience admired his pragmatism. Some called it dignified. Another prisoner, sentenced to be mauled by beasts, reportedly taunted the lions to hurry up. He slapped one across the snout. That lion, uninterested, walked away. The audience laughed. A guard, embarrassed on behalf of the animal, shoved the man toward a more obliging bear. Even emperors themselves could miscalculate. Emperor Titus, known for generosity rather than madness, once ordered 5,000 animals to be slaughtered in a single day. Lions, tigers, bears, panthers, elephants, even hippos. It was a display of imperial wealth. Yet, the crowd grew restless. Too many deaths too quickly dulled the excitement. One observer remarked that by the 1,000th kill, people were no longer cheering. They were counting. It is easy to imagine Rome as a society gleefully bloodthirsty. But perhaps it was not simple bloodlust that sustained the arena, it was routine. Just as modern audiences watch films knowing they are fictional, yet still craving emotional rhythm, Romans needed structure. They needed the thrill of uncertainty contained within the certainty of performance. When that containment cracked, when lions refused, platforms collapsed, or condemned men sang defiantly, the illusion broke. The arena was not a window into savagery. It was a mirror of bureaucracy. A system that sought to standardize death as entertainment could not tolerate surprise. But what happens when surprise becomes unavoidable? There was a moment in Rome's history when the audience did not cheer, when they did not boo or demand better choreography. When they simply fell silent, it was not because of a malfunction of trapdoors or an animal gone rogue. It was because the condemned themselves changed, not in behavior, but in belief. In the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, a new group began appearing in the arena: Christians. Unlike many condemned, they did not beg, or run, or plead with the crowd. They accepted death calmly, even gratefully. They sang as they were mauled. They forgave their executioners aloud. They refused to fear. This disturbed the rhythm of the spectacle. Executions were meant to inspire fear in the audience, not admiration. They were meant to reinforce power, not provoke reflection. And yet, some Romans reportedly left the arena unsettled. It is said that on one such occasion, after witnessing a group of Christians die without resistance, a spectator walked out murmuring, "Why do they die?" as if it were a victory. The machinery of death had met something it could not process: indifference. Which leads to a larger question: if Rome depended on violence as entertainment, what happened when people stopped finding it entertaining? Did the arena die because it became morally intolerable, or simply because it became boring? Chapter 3: The Slow Death of the Spectacle. How Rome Grew Bored of Blood. You might expect that Rome eventually abolished the arena out of moral awakening, that one day an emperor stood before the crowd and declared, "Enough. No more blood." History, however, tends to move less by conscience and more by inconvenience. The Colosseum did not fall because Rome became kind. It faded because Rome became tired. By the 3rd century CE, the empire that once stretched proudly across continents was fraying at the edges. Wars drained the treasury. Plagues emptied the cities. Grain shipments slowed. Even exotic animals, once imported by the thousands for slaughter, became too costly to acquire. Lions had to be brought across deserts. Elephants marched across Africa. Bears shipped from the Caucasus. For every animal that reached Rome, several died en route. The spectacle could not run without supplies, but it wasn't just economics. The audience itself was changing. Generations had now grown up with the games. What had shocked their ancestors now merely entertained. What had entertained their parents now barely amused. To maintain excitement, organizers had to devise ever more elaborate performances. When simple maulings no longer impressed, they added costumes. When costumes became stale, they added narrative. When narrative wore thin, they added fire. When fire was expected, they added machinery eventually. Even the unexpected became predictable. Writers of the late empire complained that crowds grew impatient with delays. If an execution was not performed with punctuality and flair, the audience would throw bread or fruit at the officials. "We are here to be entertained," one satirist wrote in the imagined voice of a spectator. "Bring out something we have not seen before, or allow us to leave." Perhaps the most telling detail is that late Roman crowds were no longer drawn most strongly to death, but to errors. A perfectly executed performance earned applause. A botched one earned laughter. The arena had transformed from a display of domination into a crude form of slapstick. Even emperors began to lose enthusiasm. Marcus Aurelius, the so-called philosopher-emperor, openly expressed distaste for the games. He rarely attended. He preferred reading. His advisors begged him to at least show his face for political unity. He did, but often fell asleep in his seat. The machinery beneath the arena, once state-of-the-art, began to fail from neglect. Trapdoors jammed more often. Elevators misfired. In one recorded incident, instead of a lion, a crate malfunctioned and released a flock of chickens into the arena. The crowd was not amused. They shouted demands for refunds. There were still attempts to revive excitement. Emperors organized massive one-time spectacles, spending fortunes to stage naval battles or mythical reenactments. But each revival sparked only temporary enthusiasm. Rome had developed a problem familiar to modern audiences: content fatigue. Christianity, too, had begun to gnaw at the spectacle's foundations, not through revolution, but through quiet sabotage. As more Romans converted, attending executions became spiritually questionable. Some began to stay home. Others were encouraged by church leaders to donate alms instead of buying arena tickets. Of course, Christianity did not universally abolish violence. Even Christian emperors like Constantine continued gladiatorial shows for a time. But the moral certainty that once underpinned the arena, that death could be righteous entertainment, had been diluted. What had been an unquestioned ritual became a topic of debate. The final blow was not a law, but disinterest. By the late 4th century, the Colosseum was no longer the center of civic life. Festivals, chariot races, religious processions, these began to overshadow executions as preferred public amusements. The arena still functioned, but increasingly as a historical echo. A tradition kept alive because it had always been kept alive. Then came an emperor named Honorius. In 404 CE, a monk named Telemachus reportedly leapt into the arena to stop a gladiator fight. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say the crowd stoned him to death. Others say the guards executed him. But whichever version is true, the emperor took notice. Honorius declared that gladiatorial combat was to be abolished. It would be romantic to say the people rejoiced, recognizing the cruelty of their past. But reality was quieter. The law was not intensely enforced. Executions by beasts continued in some places. Illegal shows popped up. Rome did not repent. It simply moved on. By the 5th century, the Colosseum had fallen into partial disuse. Grass grew in the cracks of the arena floor. The underground machinery rusted away. The lower corridors filled with debris. Earthquakes damaged the outer walls. Stones were scavenged to build houses. The great amphitheater, once host to thousands of howling spectators, became a ruin occupied by goats in the Middle Ages. The Colosseum was repurposed as a fortress, later as a quarry. Eventually, Christian monks built altars in its arches. Pilgrims visited it not to remember sport, but to venerate supposed martyrs. Where once lions feasted, now prayers were whispered, and yet the arena system never truly disappeared. It changed costume. Public execution continued for centuries, not only in Rome, but across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Beheadings became street theater. Hangings drew crowds. Guillotine blades drew cheers during the French Revolution. In 19th century England, pickpocketing was reportedly rampant during hangings, thieves taking advantage of the crowd's distraction. One journalist noted that condemned man's final moments were not watched in solemn silence, but amidst laughter and drunken conversation. Is that so different from Rome? You live in a time that often looks back on the Colosseum with horror. You likely think, we would never do that now. You may be right. You do not attend executions. You do not cheer as animals maul men, but consider what sorts of spectacle draw attention today. Reality television thrives on humiliation. Combat sports push the limits of physical endurance. Viral videos spread the shocking, the grotesque, the outrageous. Stadiums still fill with chanting crowds. You still gather to watch conflict, albeit with rules. Perhaps the difference between Rome and now is not morality, but presentation. Rome spilled blood openly. Modernity prefers abstraction. There is a lesson in the Colosseum's demise, not of righteousness overcoming brutality, but of appetite outgrowing its menu. Rome did not stop because it felt guilty. It stopped because it got bored, and boredom may be more powerful than outrage. Think for a moment of the nameless carpenter who once hammered together the cages beneath the arena. or the rope puller who spent his life lifting lions up to the stage, or the sandraker who smoothed the ground after every execution. They were not villains. They were workers fulfilling public demand. The Colosseum was not sustained by emperors alone. It was sustained by ordinary people, as all spectacles are. Which raises a final question. If the grandest arena in history could fall not from force, but from exhaustion, what current tradition one still accepted, still embraced, might one day crumble not from shame, but simply because people stopped finding it interesting. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've now survived the Roman arena without losing a limb. Thank you for spending your quiet time here with me at Quiet Boring Sleep. If this peaceful descent into historical chaos helped you unwind, I'd be grateful if you tap like. It tells the mysterious YouTube gods that you enjoy calming tales of very unpleasant things. And if you'd like more slow, sleepy journeys through history's strangest moments, consider subscribing. There's always another softly narrated disaster waiting for you. Until then, rest well. Stay boring. And may no lions appear beneath your trapdoor tonight. Good night.